pricing, profits, and potential carve-out. A couple of housekeeping items before we get into the presentation. We will be collecting all the questions over the course of the seminar, and we will address them at the end as some of the information might be answered along the way in the material. Also, in order to get the full 1 hour CE credit, the entire presentation must be viewed. You can't game it by logging in and then logging back out 10 minutes later. Just remember, the system knows. It always knows. My name is Mikal Jeffries, and I'm a Vice President and Consultant with HORAN. As a subject matter expert in the healthcare sector, I work with clients on finding better ways to impact benefit spend using market innovation, new ways to communicate, and better processes that make a difference in both their business and their plan members. My job is to deliver strategic change through insight designed to impact plan performance and efficiency. Joining me today for color commentary and questions is Judi McKie, who is also a VP and a consultant. Judi, tell them about yourself.
Good afternoon. I am a benefits expert with more than 23 years of experience. I have my clients' best interest at heart and treat their money and issues as if they were my own. I take bold ideas and use data to find solutions and find the best way to implement them.
Great. Thanks, Judi. Learning objectives. What we want to cover over the next hour. First is we're going to continue the translation game. We're going to dive into the alphabet soup, if you will, to the pricing methodology when it comes to PBMs. We're going to talk about discounts, understand how they are calculated, where they are derived. Then the PBM, how they're making money. We're going to talk about where their margin areas are and how large the margins can be. In addition, we're going to touch on carving in versus carving out. What do you need to consider? And then lastly, we're going to compare and contrast different PBM bidding channels. We're going to look at traditional RFPs versus online. Let's take a moment to quickly talk about what we discussed in the last session in PBM 101. First, we tackled some common terms. Talked about brand, generic, specialty, open and closed formularies. But we also identified the role of the PBM, understanding that they don't just process claims, but they work on building the formularies, working on the clinical programs, building the networks, as well as working on the manufacturer negotiations. We reviewed some of the clinical strategies: prior authorization, step therapy, quantity limits. We also followed the money, figured out how the prescriptions got from the manufacturer to the patient, and who gets paid what and when. And then lastly, we touched on specialty drugs. What's so special about them? Why they're so expensive? How they have their own distribution channel. They require some special handling and administration channels, and what supporting programs go along with them. In addition, we went over some trends. Some of the current trends in the marketplace involve the PBMs integrating with the medical carriers. They say, well, it helps with helping to save money for employer spend, as well as increasing market leverage. We're seeing the manufacturers extending their patents, keeping the patents longer on those brand name drugs to help keep the competition at bay and continue to allow the manufacturers to make those obscene profits. Also hit on pharmacogenomics, precision medicine. That was a testing to figure out how the body breaks down drugs to help optimize prescription efficiency and help contain plan costs. But we also hit on some future trends. Biggest one being the increasing transparency out in the marketplace, how there's legislation out there suggesting that rebates stop going to the plan and actually go back to the members. We're seeing more outcome-based contracts and more discussions about holding the manufacturers' feet to the fire on the effectiveness of their drugs. Also hit on some of the innovation, specifically this new interest in carving specialty out from the plan in order to gain access to the manufacturer assistance programs as well as their coupon programs. It's also seeing an entry of new players. That's your Amazon and your JP Morgan. They're getting into pharmacy as well, offering a different channel. We talked about a new opportunity they have called PillPack. But to add to that future trend, we want to talk about a new future trend that we're seeing on the market as well. They're called biosimilars. Now let's read you the definition. A biosimilar is a biological medical product highly similar to another already approved biological medicine. Biosimilars are officially approved versions of the original innovator products and can be manufactured when the original product's patent expires. There's a lot going on there, so let's take a minute and let's break that down. First, did you notice the word biological? These biosimilars, they are not drugs. They are a medical product. They are medicine. What a biological product is something that's manufactured inside of a living organism, be that a microorganism, a plant, or an animal cell, versus a drug, which is manufactured through chemical synthesis, meaning that they're combining chemical ingredients together to produce a prescription. You'll see in the highlighted area, biosimilars can be manufactured when the original product patent expires. For those that attended PBM 101, that sounds very similar to a generic, but it's not a generic. So let's take a moment to compare and contrast your generics versus your biosimilars. First area. Are both available when the patents expire on those expensive brand name drugs? Yep. Both biosimilars and generics are allowed to enter the market when the patent expires. What about being marketed as a cheaper version of a name brand RX? Once again, applies to both the biosimilar and the generic. They are an alternative available to help contain costs. Are they designed to have the same clinical effect as the brand RX? Again, biosimilar, generic, very similar. However, now we're going to get into some differences. Is it identical to the brand RX in chemical composition? Is generic? Yes. But for the biosimilar, no, it is not. The reason it's not in the same chemical composition is because it is a biologic. Again, it is grown inside of a cell, which does not allow for the exact same chemical composition because it's not a synthetic process. And the savings from brand. Now, both are designed to provide savings against the brand name, but you see there's a pretty big difference in savings available. While the generic, you typically see 50 to 90% off savings off of that brand name cost. From a biosimilar standpoint, you only get 20 to 30% off. Difference in savings is due to biosimilars take a lot longer to come to market. There's more R&D, there's more testing, there's more overhead, thus not producing as strong as savings. So let's dive a little bit further into that biosimilar definition. In the prior slide, we talked in the definition, it mentioned highly similar, which means it's not exactly the same as the brand name. But by highly similar to the brand name, what we're saying is clinically, there is no meaningful difference when it comes to safety, purity, and potency. Meaning it goes through the same process, the same rigorous process through the FDA in order to get it approved. What highly similar means is it's close enough. Close enough to accomplish similar therapeutic and clinical outcomes, but it's not interchangeable because it's not an exact copy. When I say interchangeable is more common when you're talking about brand names and generic drugs. Since the generic is a replica of the brand name, it is interchangeable. Whereas biosimilars, they are biologics like their biologic brand names. It's close to providing the same results, but not an exact copy. But biosimilars address a very, very limited area of coverage. They are used to treat patients with cancer, kidney disease, and autoimmune disease, or commonly known as rheumatoid arthritis or Crohn's disease. Give you an example, Humira. Most of you have probably seen a commercial or have heard an ad about Humira. Now, there is no generic alternative available for Humira, and that's because it's a biologic medication. So to put it all together, generics can only replicate a chemically derived brand name because it's a synthetic copy. So if something has a biologic, it can't have a generic equivalent. However, a biosimilar, they are derived from living organisms, so like the brand name biologics, they're close in replication, but they're not exactly the same. The hope is both of these items put together are going to operate in the same way to contain costs. And there's one study showing that they think biosimilars could save the U.S. health system around $44 billion over the next decade.
And it's interesting, Michael, because there's a slow uptake or adoption rate for these drugs. And an example of that is Zirabev, which is a biosimilar to Avastin, which is a chemo drug, and it's 23% less in cost. But because we don't know what we don't know and how these can impact others, doctors aren't prescribing them as quickly.
Correct. That's when you come back to this conversation about interchangeable. When you have interchangeable, the doctors are a little less educated on it, and they're a little hesitant to automatically swap out a known outcome for something that is highly similar. In addition, they're just not up to speed on a lot of the biosimilars in general, even knowing that the options are out there.
Well, another example is you've got 2 drugs for Enbrel and 5 for Humira, and that treats the autoimmune diseases, and they're approved by the FDA, but they've not been dispensed yet.
Yep, and just like we talked about in that current trend, that's the patent game. So Humira has the ability to continue to extend their patents, so we have these biosimilars waiting in the wings, but until that patent expires, they don't have the opportunity to provide competition and be introduced into the market. Let's also take a minute to go review the flow review that we had at the end of PBM 101, because this we're going to revisit later when we start talking about pricing margins. So if you recall, you have the employer and you have the carrier who houses the PBM. The employer has a services contract with the PBM that contains the discounts, how much they're going to reimburse, how much they're going to charge, what networks they're going to access. The carrier has an agreement with the manufacturer. That's a formulary agreement. That agreement is set up to figure out what drugs go onto the formulary that are produced by the manufacturer. The pharmacy, they have a network contract with the PBM. They sign the contract to be a part of their network so that the PBM can steer all of their members into that pharmacy so that they get volume and they get reimbursements. The wholesaler, while you don't see a whole lot of it from an employer perspective or a member perspective, the wholesaler plays a key role because they have a service agreement with the manufacturer, meaning they're the ones who buy the drugs from the manufacturer and then deliver them to the pharmacy under a vendor agreement. So the pharmacy has 2 contracts. They contract with the wholesaler to get the drugs, but they also have a contract with the PBM to have access to their network. So as far as how the prescription flows, the manufacturer delivers the drug to the wholesaler. The wholesaler delivers the drugs to the pharmacy. Pharmacy then dispenses the RX to the patient. Now we get into the flow of the money. Since the wholesaler purchased the drugs from the manufacturer, they make payment to the manufacturer. So the way this process works is one area pays and then they get reimbursed by another area. So the wholesaler pays the manufacturer, the pharmacy reimburses the wholesaler with their payment. But since the pharmacy has now paid the wholesaler, they also collect coinsurance and copayment or copayment from the patient for partial reimbursement, but they also get reimbursed from the PBM based on the network contract. So now the PBM has paid out funds. They will then get reimbursed by the employer based on their services contract. And then lastly, manufacturer produces rebates, which go to the PBM, and then the PBM has different options of what they can do with that. They can either pass it through directly to the employer or they can provide an administrative credit. So the key to this is to keep in mind the payment, the flow of the money, because now we're going to start identifying what margins look like for those different channels of flow in a few slides. Which brings us into PBM 201. Let's start talking about the pricing jargon. First thing you're going to hear about is the wholesale acquisition cost, also known as WAC. WAC applies to both brand as well as generics. It's the actual selling price set by the manufacturer. It's also used to calculate rebates. So think of WAC as the starting point, which everything branches off of. brings us to AWP, average wholesale price. Now the AWP, these are three nasty little letters that cause a lot of controversy, which I'll get to in a moment. But just to give you a couple of objective points behind AWP, it applies, again, to both brand names and generics. It's the price used for reimbursement. So with that prior slide, when you saw the pharmacy getting reimbursed, and then you saw the PBM getting reimbursed from the employer, this is what they're getting reimbursed on, is they're getting reimbursed off of this AWP price. It's derived from WAC, which is why it applies to both the brand names as well as the generics. Calculated as 120% of WAC. Now I have a asterisk there because just for simplicity of math, I'm going to use this methodology for our examples going through the slides coming up, but understand there's some variables sitting inside of AWP we'll talk about in just a minute, but just for calculation purposes, we'll call it 120%. Then you have your rebate. Rebate also negotiated by the manufacturer, also calculated off of WAC, offered on brand name RX, and the PBM has three basic options. They can either share the percentage of the rebate with the employer, they can pass it completely through to the employer, or they can keep it for themselves. And then you have MAC. MAC is the maximum allowable cost. It applies only to generics. What it does is it provides an upper limit or a maximum that a plan will pay for generic prescriptions and brand name RX that have generic versions. The idea is to offer price consistency because you see a lot of fluctuation in pricing when it comes to these generics. So let's help solidify a little more. Let's give you a math problem. So let's say drug A, the WAC is $100. If it's $100, we'll say that the AWP is $120, right? Because AWP is going to be 120% of WAC. The rebate, if drug A has a 10% rebate, that 10% of the $100 would be $10. So based on the three rebate options that the PBM has, if it's a percentage share example, let's say the employer gets 25%, they would get $2.50 of that $10. PBM gets the balance, the $7.50. If it's a full pass-through example, then the employer gets all the money, PBM retains nothing. And then lastly is PBM keeps the example. They keep the entire amount. They keep the full $10, employer gets nothing, and for that situation when the PBM applies more, then they have the ability to offer an administrative credit against the monthly cost for that PBM contract, which we'll go into further later in the presentation.
And Michael, that's a lot of information and a lot of moving parts. Is there any defined pricing for a prescription drug? That's
the struggle. That's what we're going to get to, is there is no defined pricing. That's the frustration of the PBM world. It is the only commodity that I can think of where there is no known set price.
And then is there any legislation that we know of that will set that price and potentially stabilize costs of drugs?
There is. There's legislation out there right now that they're trying to convert from AWP to a more transparent pricing platform. Struggle is it's not getting a lot of traction because we have the PBM lobby is pretty strong at the moment. But the idea is let's bring it on par with other commodities that the price is more transparent. Which brings us to the AWP controversy. Here's the definition of AWP. So one definition says it's the published price for a drug product based on data obtained from manufacturers, distributors, and suppliers. But another definition says, well, it's the average price paid by a pharmacist, the retailer, to buy a drug from the wholesaler. So we have a couple of conflicting definitions to begin with. They also can be determined several different ways. Main ways. First one, the manufacturer provides it to the AWP publishers. There's two main publishers of the AWP lists. That's Metaspan and First Data Bank. The second is the publisher, Metaspan or First Data Bank, they calculate the AWP based on the WAC with the markup provided by the manufacturer. And then third, it's the one I talked about in the prior example. Publisher applies 20% to the WAC provided by the manufacturer. You notice all three of those calculations are all being provided by the manufacturer. But the definitions above would suggest that it's based on data obtained from manufacturers, distributors, suppliers, and the pharmacist. But I don't see that anywhere in this calculation. It's all referencing to being provided by the manufacturer. So that gives you some truths. First one is AWP. It's not a true representation price for either generic or brand name drugs. It's an arbitrary number. Think of it as the list price or the sticker price. It's the elevated drug price that's rarely paid for what's actually being paid by the sources referenced in those definitions. And here's the biggest. It's not a government-regulated figure. It means it could be subject to manipulation. Bottom line, the AWP, it's an arbitrary figure, it's made up by the manufacturer, has nothing to do with the wholesale price, it has nothing to do with what the drug is actually worth, and it has nothing to do with the average price as well. Frustrating as all of that is, it's really the only game in town. It's the industry standard right now for Medicaid as well as the commercial market.
And it's really scary because we all know that drug costs are up to 30% of the average total health plan cost. So it's really important that eventually we get a handle on this, not only for employers, but for employees.
Precisely. So I think a more accurate definition is it's simply a benchmark used to determine pricing and reimbursement of prescription drugs to third parties. That's all it is. It's a number made by the manufacturer, they discount off of for reimbursements. All right, so I will get off my soapbox on AWP. But if you think about it, AWP is really kind of whack. A little PBM humor there for you. Moving on. Maximal allowable costs. We covered it a couple of slides ago. Purpose is to encourage pharmacies to purchase the least costly generic drugs available. Reason being, when they purchase drugs from the wholesaler, generic drugs have a bunch of different prices. You have 4 different prices for the same drug, anywhere from, actually there's 5, from 19 to 45 cents. So what the MAC does, the maximum allowable cost, is it would say in this example, the most that the plan is going to reimburse the pharmacy for those drugs is 25 cents on the generic. What that does is that keeps the pharmacies from buying drugs at the higher prices to get higher margins on their reimbursement. So it's designed to protect the employer plan by setting a ceiling. But a couple of caveats to that. First is PBM is a generator that generates the list. No 2 MAC lists are alike. PBM is free to pick and choose who they want to have on that MAC list. So you don't know if it's being optimized or not. So essentially the client is left in the dark. So while in theory it's a good idea to help keep it in play, help contain costs, there's still some areas there of not knowing how it is being built and what's being contained on top of it. Network discounts. The network discount is a percentage off of AWP, right? That frustrating number I just told you about a couple of slides ago. It's negotiated by the PBM, applies to both brand names as well as the generics. So here's the example. Drug A, AWP is $100. The PBM contract discount is AWP minus 17. So that brand name, drug A, costs the plan $83. It took $100, took off 17%, or took $100 times 83%. So you get a discount, and those are in finger quotes, off of AWP, but you don't know if that starting number is the right number. It varies by PBM, varies by drug, varies by plan sponsor. Here's a benchmark to give you an idea of where most discounts fall into play. From a brand standpoint, retail, it's 19 to 21% off AWP. Mail is a little bit higher, 21 to 24%. Generics, clearly, since they're less expensive than the brand names, they generate higher discounts. So that's 82 to 85% or 84 to 86. Bigger discounts on the mail versus the retail because there's less overhead. There's less cost involved, therefore they're allowed to give a bigger discount off of the AWP. But not all discounts are created equal. What are the driver of discounts? One is the employer. Bigger the employer, bigger the discount. You have leverage. You can negotiate a better discount when you're talking about 10,000 lives versus arguing a discount when you have 1,000 lives. You can also have bigger discounts if you're willing to trade off. So those three rebate options that we discussed, if the more the PBM is allowed to keep of the rebates, the higher the discounts that they're willing to allow inside the plan. Now, our best practice suggests that you want to be able to keep all of those rebates, just in the interest of transparency. Which brings us to dispensing fees. Dispensing fees apply to both brand names and generics. What a dispensing fee is, it's simply a fee that is paid to the pharmacist to process the prescription, to literally take it off the shelf, put it in the bottle, hand it to the member. Now, obviously, it's a little more detailed than that, but it's literally just dispensing, providing it, giving it to the member. It varies by type of pharmacy as well. Much like you have for discounts, you can argue that the larger the pharmacy, the larger the dispensing fees. Here's a benchmark for dispensing fees as well. You'll see 75 cents to $1 on brands, and 0 to 50 cents on mail. You'll notice the dispensing fees for brand and generics are the same because it's the same transaction. But it's common for the PBM to waive dispensing fees for mail order. That's why you see the low end at 0, or for large chains to waive it in retail. And the reason that they waive it in retail is they are able to negotiate higher discounts for reimbursement off of AWP, so they're willing to give up one to get the other.
And Michael, is there any information or tools that a provider can use to help an employee navigate prescription drugs? Yeah,
there's a lot. And we're gonna talk more in detail about that in 301, but most of the carriers, there's a couple of exceptions, they do have tools that allow the prescribing physician to integrate into the plan design as well as the formulary to figure out what drugs are available at what price point to help maintain treating the condition, but also optimizing the cost value. So back to the flow. But now we're going to follow the money. Follow the money in the form of the margins. And this I'm showing you right now is for one transaction. But we have to understand some variable costs first. First one is, let's assume in this example, the WAC is $100. AWP is 120, right? 20% more of WAC. The employer, they get 25% of all rebates. The AWP discount for the employer is AWP minus 14%. The ER dispensing fee is $1.40. The pharmacy AWP discount is 15%. And the pharmacy dispensing fee is $1. So let's take one prescription. So that pharmacy paid $100, paid the WAC to the wholesaler for the drug. So they're out $100, but they get reimbursed from the carrier. They get reimbursed AWP minus 15% or $102. So if they paid out $100, they get reimbursed $102. They've now made a $2 margin on that first prescription. But the PBM, they've paid out that $102. So they turn around and they bill the employer. Now remember, the employer discount is AWP minus 14%, which equates to $103.20. So the PBM paid out $102, they received $103.2. They've made $1.20 on that margin based on just that drug because of the spread between what they reimburse and what they charge. The carrier also pays that $1 dispensing fee to the pharmacy per the contract. So the pharmacy receives $1, which is just pure margin. It's just a transaction. But now they're out $1. So per the employer contract, they're going to get reimbursed from the employer $1.40, the dispensing fee. So they laid out $1, but they received $1.40. So there's another 40 cents in margin. That leaves us with the rebate. So the rebate is $30. The employer gets 25% of that rebate, which is $7.50. So while the PBM receives $30, they give up $7.50, which means they keep $22.50. So collectively, that PBM on that one transaction made $24.10 based on the contracts, based on the price spreads, while the pharmacy made a margin of $3. So take this one transaction and put it in perspective. If you add volume against that, in 2019, there were almost 4.4 billion prescriptions written. So take those billions of transactions against that total margin. Now, I'm not saying PBMs can't make margin. They're in the business of making money. Our job is to identify those margin areas and minimize or contain them whenever possible. But now you understand where they make their fees, which is when we start focusing in 301 on contracts, what best practice language looks like. Let's talk about carve in versus carve out. Carve in. Carve in is when the medical carrier has a relationship with the PBM. All fully insured plans have a carved in benefit. ASO can be either way. But in either instance, the employer has no direct relationship with that PBM. Versus a carve out, the client has a contract with both the medical carrier as well as the PBM. They're in the middle versus being on the end. There's a direct relationship there. But not all employers can carve out. Different carriers have different carve out requirements. For example, fully insured can't carve out. It's not necessarily an option for you. Anthem, they have a level that says you have to have at least 1,000 lives on the plan before you can look at carving out. So even if you wanted to, the contract language forbids you from doing so. UHC and Aetna, they have lower requirements, somewhere around 100 lives, whereas Humana has no minimum whatsoever. Both carve in and carve out each have their pros and cons, each have their considerations. Let's talk about those. For carving in, probably one of the most obvious advantages is just one vendor. Simplifies your administration. So you have one vendor that does both medical and RX, which means you get one bill, which means you get one ID card, which means you have one website. Makes things a lot easier. Now the carriers will argue that there's potential for better coordination of care because there's full integration. Medical and RX are talking back and forth to each other because they're both sitting underneath the same umbrella. Easier coordination with stop loss. So when you have stop loss, rather than having to collect information from two different vendors for setting over to the stop loss for protection under the contract language, it's one feed, it's an aggregate, makes things simpler because they're under the same timelines. But there's also disadvantages. With simplicity comes less flexibility with plan design. While they might have a few options available on a carve-in situation, you may not have the ability to pick and choose and truly tailor the program to your benefit. Their carve-in strategies typically have a one-size-fits-all, but every plan has its own unique needs. Limited transparency or audit rights. Since it's under one carrier, it's not direct. It doesn't have as transparent a language when you have the entities as separate. Now the audit rights might be limited by group size as well, or the contract language just says from a carve-in perspective, you don't have the option to audit. Audit meaning having a third party come in and review how the claims were processed through the contract over a period of time to see if the claims were processed correctly. And here's the stickler, is penalty fees. Carriers, a lot of carriers, they charge a carve-out fee. So if it's carved in and you want to carve it out, they're going to charge you a PEPM rate in order to do so. The fact that they're charging you a PEPM rate tells me that that's one of those margin areas. It's where they're making money. Now they'll say that it's to help cover the cost for integration, but I would argue that it is a margin area for them, which is why they charge it. By charging that carve-out fee, that can eat into potential savings when you do carve out with another PBM. So let's talk about the advantages of carving out. Clearly, you have more flexibility in plan design because you're having the contract directly with the PBM, so you can pick and choose, go more a la carte from a plan design as well as clinical programs, more so than you can from a carved-in perspective. Plus, there's increased transparency. It allows more visibility into the true cost of the prescription drugs since the PBMs have the ability to enter into transparent arrangements versus limitations of being carved in. That comes in a lot of different areas, such as pricing, better analytics, audit rights. They give you the opportunity to customize that benefit plan to make sure that it's impacting the overall cost and you're managing your risk, improving those annual outcomes. A lot of them will offer annual market checks. You can go out every year, make sure that the market can't provide a better opportunity than what you have right now from the incumbent. They're also, with advantages, they also have disadvantages. A disadvantage is perceived as there's multiple vendors. That could be a potential for increased administrative burden. When you carve out, now you have 2 ID cards. Now you might have 2 websites. Now you're going to have 2 bills. So you might have the disruption, the burden from an admin standpoint, but it could be a disadvantage from a disruption from the member's eyes. So now to them, it could be perceived as more involved because now I have to use 1 card for pharmacy, 1 card for my medical. With the member disruption, while we talk about ID cards and multiple websites, you also run into issues with disruption, meaning what drug was covered under a formulary may no longer be covered under the new formulary, or the drug that was a tier 1 may go to a tier 2, or it's in a tier 2 went to a tier 3. So disruption comes in a bunch of different categories, but collectively, the argument is carve out can provide lower drug costs through more aggressive bidding. Now, I'm not saying carve in is bad, carve out is good. It's not one or the other, but you have to figure out which one is the best fit based on your cost, your strategy, your culture, as well as your opportunities. Because you might be in a carve-in situation where all is right with the world. Plan is running the way that it needs to. So there's considerations when you're looking at carving in or carving out. Here's just a handful of questions. Clearly not an exhaustive list. How much are your pharmacy benefits costing you right now? Do you have a firm understanding as to how the costs are relative to norms and benchmark? Are you running higher than everybody else? Are you running where it should be? Don't carve out just for the sake of carving out.
Michael, in general, and I don't think you're going to state this in these questions, but what size group would typically, or what type of group would typically consider carving in versus carving out?
Well, it comes down to one, size. Size makes a big difference. It's typically reserved for larger employers to carve out when you're talking from a size standpoint. The reason being, when you have, say, for example, 5,000 people, you carry a lot more weight, a lot more leverage when you're negotiating discounts with another PBM because they want all the bodies, all the members on the plan. But at the same standpoint, if you have a plan, an employer that maybe it's not 5,000, but maybe they're more aggressive. Maybe they want to get more tailored, more involved with their drug spend, and the contract allows them to do so. By being able to be more involved, they're willing to carve out to take on more administration potentially in order for stronger discounts. So it's not you fit an exact category to go carve in versus carve out. There is some art along with the science. Does your medical health vendor, do they pass through your rebates? Remember, because you have options with rebates. They can either keep them, they can pass them along in full, or they can pass them along in a percentage standpoint.
And I did want to make a comment about the rebates, because some employers choose to have rebates be a function of administration. So you get a rebate credit to lower your admin fee and your medical plan costs, instead of getting a percentage of the actual rebates. And they do this because it's more predictable, where the rebates, if you get them directly as a percentage, you get them every quarter, and there's a lag. But also sometimes finance keeps those dollars and does them not put them back in the medical plan. So HR wants to be able to retain those as a cost savings to the plan. So there are reasons sometimes when you wouldn't do direct rebates.
Absolutely, and that's part of a deeper discussion when you're talking about containing costs. It's not an absolute. When we talk about best practice means full pass-through, we're doing that from a standpoint of full transparency. But sometimes it makes more sense to have more predictability over the course of the year through an admin credit versus waiting to receive a rebate, which may be a larger figure at a later point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Is the timing right to conduct the RFP? Are you doing it in conjunction with your medical? Are you going to do it off-cycle? Is there a penalty for doing it off-cycle? You have to look into your PBM contract to see if you leave mid-year, is there a financial penalty involved? Is there a potential for giving up rebates that you're foregoing under the existing contract? Because the PBM RFP can operate in either camp. It's what makes the most sense. What do you have the time to do? It's not something that you rush through. So if you have an effective date 60 days out and you want to do a PBM bid, probably not the best time to do it. You need to do it when you have more time available to you, because with that disruption, you might be able to optimize the contract, but you don't want to sacrifice any potential errors through implementation. As I mentioned before, what's the potential carve-out fee from your medical plan? You got to do the math on it, because when you're getting savings if you get savings on that proposal from other PBMs, most likely that's not taking into consideration the carve-out fee that could be eating into the potential savings.
And the other cost consideration is when you're talking about the 4 big PBMs, most administrators have connectivity with those already. But if you are looking at a smaller PBM, there's a lot of them, and they're coming up with creative strategies, there may be an implementation cost to create that integration.
Exactly, and the implementation could be billed on their side, that could be software billed on the medical carrier side, or that could just be the charge for those initial set of feeds that don't currently exist. And what's your willingness to change? How open are you to disruption? As I mentioned before, disruption comes in a lot of different categories. Disruption could be disruption to HR, that could be disruption to your plan members. I'm not saying disruption is bad, because often improvements in plan come with disruption, but just understanding what that willingness is to change. Don't just go out to bid just because you think that's what you need to do. Which takes us in to bids. So when we take the pharmacy out to bid, you have there's multiple options, but we're going to focus on two that fall into two distinct categories. The first one is online, and it's through a vendor called TrueBid. Now, what TrueBid does is it's a web-based software platform, and they're designed to hit on 4 key buckets. First one is to optimize the bid process. So they work with the procurement, the oversight, and the plan performance of an RFP bid. And they do this with a couple of different options, but one of them is a multi-round reverse auction that allows multiple PBM participants to participate, full transparency, and they run a comparison of the claims, the reprice, through their software. Now, when you typically do a reprice, and when a PBM does reprice for you, they don't do 100%. They'll usually do 85 to 90%. There's some that they either can't figure out, or they don't reprice because it's not competitive for them. This is a completely objective reprice, so that they reprice 100% of those claims to see what would it have looked like under the contract that they're talking about. They also want to tighten up the PBM contracts. So they offer best practices to avoid loopholes and as well as to maximize rebates. And they want to make sure that they optimize the discounts as well through RX classification. We talk about RX classification, for example, it's making sure that the definition of a generic is the appropriate definition of generic, and that the definition of generic is consistent across all those that are participating. They also monitor plan performance. They offer real-time monitoring over the course of the plan to make sure that the claims are processing relative to the contract. So for example, if contract language says that the pricing operates under a lesser of 2 price points, they want to make sure that the claim does process the way that it needs to. But they also want to do an analysis to see if there's any other savings opportunities from either plan design or rebate. And then they want to ensure the effective plan design. So they have subject matter experts that are part of the process that do analysis of utilization as well as recommended potential plan design changes. And then they do the disruptions for reducing formularies or doing network disruptions. With TrueBid, collectively, it's more about savings than it is in flexibility. However, they do have the opportunity to provide substantial savings through a couple of different products. The first one is TrueBid. TrueBid is the full RFP process, operates mid to large size employers. Now we say mid to large size employers, they are referencing somewhere around 1,500 lives, not employees, lives, bodies on the plan or bigger. That's that reverse auction platform. What it does is it's a package RFP. So they upload the PBM details, all the contracts are side by side for comparison. They highlight all the exceptions, and then they pit them against each other in reverse auction. First round, it ends, it says, here's where you stack up. PBM A, PBM B, PBM C. Now it's de-identified. It's not going to actually list so you know who your competition is. They just know where you are relative to the competition. Gives you an opportunity for the PBMs to update and tighten up their pricing, gives them ranking, and then ultimately determines the winner from a cost standpoint. The interesting thing about TrueBid, specifically the TrueBid, now the average plan savings they're talking are 10 to 15% off the in-force costs. But what we've found with using this is about 70% of those who participated through this TrueBid process, 70% of them stayed with the incumbent, didn't go anywhere.
And there's also a higher cost for TrueBid just because there's a lot more work in monitoring around that.
Yes, so TrueBid does come with a cost. The cost is going to be relative to what services you need inside that full RFP. That's a conversation that's tailored and that's unique to the client size. The way that it typically works is the winning PBM, who is awarded the contract, absorbs the cost. So when we're talking about the average plan savings at 10 to 15%, that savings that are being produced includes the cost of running the RFP. So it's not something that the employer takes on. We work to make sure that the winner of who's awarded the business, they absorb that cost. A couple of limitations with TrueBid. They do have limited slots. You can have multiple PBMs participate, but it's limited to 10 slots. Meaning, if you have one carrier that has, say, 3 formularies that you want to see the price of all 3 formularies, then they're going to take up 3 of the 10 spaces. It takes about 90 days to complete that process and 3 months to implement. But a couple other things to consider is once you turn it on, you can't turn it off. So you can't step into it and then say, I think we'll just keep doing what we're doing. We don't have time. We're too busy. The charge would still come into play. If you do nothing whatsoever, if you stay with the incumbent, hopefully the contract gets tightened up. It gets you those savings, which is a little frustrating. But at the end of the day, I'd rather have you tighten up the contract and have no disruption by maintaining with the current carrier. They would absorb that cost. So again, more cost-driven than it is from a flexibility standpoint. Then you have TrueBid Express. That's your small to mid-sized employers. So that's 150 to 1,500. This is more of an off-the-shelf, pre-negotiated PBM contracts. You can instantly compare the offers based on your claims data with those pre-negotiated contracts. They'll apply into all their options, give you a summary of annual savings as well as member impact, and you can decide, do you want to stay where you are or do you want to move? So it's a little simpler, designed for the smaller client. It too has a cost, but the cost is drastically less than the TrueBid because it's more automated, if you were.
And they do send you like an annual review of discrepancies in your contract, but it's not as detailed and in-depth as when you do the TrueBid.
Correct, correct. And they also have a couple of other items available as far as ongoing monitoring or actually an audit process. If you don't want to use them for a bidding, they can do it from a monitoring standpoint outside of these two products. Here's a quick case study, how TrueBid works. So this is a HORAN client, it's a health consortium. They use the TrueBid, the full RFP process. And what they realized going through the exercise is they saved actually 17% on their pharmacy spend, which is $7 million over the course of 3 years. That which, if you look at it from a total spend, it's just under 4%. They saved 3.8% of their overall cost. Here's the thing, that savings, they tightened up the contract, got better language, and they stayed with the incumbent. So they didn't have the disruption of the membership, but they were able to get a better deal than what they currently had in force. A little frustrating to be with the incumbent, knowing that they were charging you more than they should have. While I know it's frustrating, hey, the savings helps contain the cost, get you to a better place. Then you have the traditional PBM model. That's where HORAN handles the build, the submission, and negotiation of the RFP process, as well as the final contract. Benefits. This is for those that aren't eligible for the Carve Out, or they're based on your size or your carrier restrictions. So we can do this alongside the medical RFP for you. Unlimited space for responses. Rather than have that 10-slot category, we can talk to as many PBMs as we want. We can look at as many formularies as we want. So it's a lot broader. It's easier to pivot mid-process. So if we get into an RFP and we want to start making changes mid-quote, we can do that. Versus TrueBid, that once it starts, it only knows to work on what variables are already locked down. You have more plan design flexibility, get more customization. This is a big area as well. Huge opportunity for the PBMs to better articulate their value adds and their clinical effectiveness. TrueBid doesn't give them the opportunity for the conversation, for the one-on-ones, for the materials to say how their pre-op works, how their step therapy works. It just verifies that they have it, whereas this gives you an opportunity to learn more about it. Takes a little longer than TrueBid, but the reason it takes longer is it's a little more granular. We have the opportunity to have more back and forth, to peel into the data, ask for additional information, hold finalist meetings, those sorts of things, which we think is to the benefit to optimize the contract. You can withdraw the RFP at any time. If you get started and then want to stop it midway for whatever reason, because of restrictions or because of union negotiations prevent it from happening, you have the ability. You also have input review from a pharma MD that we keep on retainer. That allows us to get that professional opinion as well as get a second opinion on best contract in areas of concern. And we also use it for, we also get supported by the aggregate of our book of business. So we use the data inside our book of business to help with establishing norms and benchmarking to measure against how you're performing relative to a metric. So you understand relative measure, what's good and what's bad.
And a traditional RFP will take more time, so you do want to build that in. But like Michael said, it creates more flexibility in order to achieve your goals. So we do have just one question. So Michael must have done such a great job, very clear in your communication today. And so do biosimilars have more or less side effects? So that's a really tricky question because each of us absorb medication differently. So I could take the same drug as somebody else and have a different side effect. Because they are not truly exactly the same, there could be more side effects, and I think there's just not a lot known about biosimilars today to know how one person would react. And that would be a discussion you would have with your physician.
Exactly. So that's one of the reasons why the adoption rate is still on the lower end, is because while they're similar as a biologic, they haven't hit the market and been around long enough to know if there are side effects, it's the same side effects, is it worse, is it less? So Judi brings up a good point of it's how your body breaks down that medicine. Good question. So that brings us to the end of HORAN PBM 201. Thanks for attending. We hope we provide some additional understanding and clarity of PBM as we get ready for the next webinar. That's coming soon. So we have PBM 301. We're going to go into cost containment and contract language. It's April 1st, 12 to 1. If you've registered, we look forward to meeting again. If you haven't registered, there's still time. We will send out a reminder communication with the registration link. We look forward to sharing with more insight on PBMs next time. And we appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us. We'll talk to everyone soon. Thanks.